Hello, and welcome to this week's Oxford at Home. It's a great pleasure to have so many of you coming in from around the world, as usual, to hear our insight into the research, writing and teaching that's going on at the University of Oxford, even during the time when we're locked down, but slowly re-emerging into the light as part of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Rana Mitter. I teach Chinese history and politics here at Oxford, but today my role is to introduce our speaker. And I'm going to do that, if I may, by quoting a line from the great Anthony Trollope and his novel, The Way We Live Now. Since the beginning of that novel, one of his characters, a novelist called Lady Carberry, writes about her criminal queens, a sort of blockbuster potboiler that she's writing. And she's very, how can I put it, effusive about these characters. Mary, Queen of Scots, she says, is guilty, guilty always. But Marie-Antoinette, the 18th century French queen, she says, I have not quite acquitted. And that adds, I have accused her lovingly and have kissed when I scourged. Well, Marie-Antoinette was a subject of some interest for Trollope's character, Lady Carberry. I'm sure she'll be even more interesting when we hear from our speaker today. So I'm delighted to say that we have with us today Professor Catriona Seth, Marshal Foch Professor of French Literature and a Fellow of All Souls College here at Oxford. She's very well known for her work on French literature and the cultural history of the Enlightenment, what's sometimes known as the long 18th century, from the period 1760 to 1860 in particular. And Catriona is very international, as many people are at Oxford, having been brought up in Switzerland, Belgium and South America, but spent most of her working life actually in France. Catriona's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so today, and then we're going to have 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end, as we always do. Please remember that you can send them in through the chat window if you're watching on YouTube, or the comments section of Facebook. We're not on Twitter today, unfortunately. As you may have heard, various malign actors have done bad things to Twitter recently, so we're not for this week able to use that. Do remember, as ever, we're working off our home Wi-Fi as ever, so there's a glitch. Just bear with us for a few seconds, and we should be back in. And to tell us about the Queen's secrets, 18th century France, huge pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Catriona Seth. Catriona.
Thank you very much, Rana. And since you're all over the world and I'm in Oxford, I thought I'd take you on a journey to 18th century France, thanks to some archive documents. We're going to talk about one of the most famous characters in history, Marie-Antoinette, as Rana just said. Marie-Antoinette was painted by the top artists in her lifetime, depicted as a charming young girl and as a fashionable role model. She was also caricatured and reviled, her reputation besmirched through often false allegations of misconduct. She was talked about in diplomatic dispatches, in private correspondences, in countless periodicals. And after her death, she was often portrayed as a martyr. But who was Marie-Antoinette, and can we get to the real woman behind the myth? I've tried to answer this with a recent research project based largely on documents from the Imperial Archives in Vienna. Now, a quick reminder of Marie-Antoinette's timeline. She was born in 1755, 14th of 15 children. Her mother, the very wily Empress Maria Theresa, used her children as political pawns. Thanks to her selection of marriage partners for them, she extended the influence of the Habsburg network across Europe. Her greatest success came when, to cement the unexpected treaty with France concluded shortly after Marie-Antoinette's birth, she agreed to marry her youngest daughter to the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Louis. While preparations were being made for the teenaged Archduchess to go to France, her hair was styled in the French manner, her teeth were straightened, and she was given extra lessons in French history. The French clergyman, Abbé Vermont, sent from Versailles to tutor her, also set about ensuring her French was more correct. Now, French was the official court language in Austria at the time, but Vermont, like many Frenchmen, even now was quite particular about grammar and usage. He complained about the multilingual environment in which the young girl lived. Il sera bien difficile qu'elle se perfectionne ici. Il faudrait qu'elle ne parlât et n'entendît parler que français, et un français pur, ce qui est impossible dans un pays où tout le monde parle 3 langues. I like the idea of a multilingual court. It seems to me something to be imitated rather than disparaged, but there we are. At the age of 14, the Archduchess was packed off to her new life in Versailles. The handover took place in a tent on an island on the Rhine. Her Austrian attendants left her, and she was escorted by French courtiers. It must have been traumatizing. Maria Theresa had written out strict instructions for her daughter about her duties and had also told her to look to one person in times of need, the Austrian ambassador, Count Merci. Merci was a career diplomat, born in Liège, currently in Belgium. He was of the Empress's generation and spent much of his life in France. Like the other ambassadors, he lived in Paris, whereas Marie-Antoinette, as the Archduchess was known in her new country, lived in Versailles. Now, nowadays, of course, there are suburban trains between the capital and the palace. At the time, it would have taken you over an hour, were your horse to have been galloping freely, to cover the 20 kilometers which separated Mercy's residence, now the president of the French Senate's house, and Versailles. Life in the French court was very public, and visitors were scrutinized and their motives discussed. So though he represented her homeland, Merci couldn't just drop in on Marie-Antoinette. As a result, the princess and the diplomat exchanged letters and notes, and there are over 100 from Marie-Antoinette to him. They represent about a fifth of her known letters and stretch from her early time in Versailles to the final years of her life when she was imprisoned in Paris before being executed. And looking at these archives is a bit like being a historical detective searching for clues. So here is the first letter in the exchange. It's a note. In all likelihood, it dates from 1771, and it says, "Je vous prie d'envoyer cette lettre par la poste. Je l'ai bien examinée. Il n'y a rien qu'on y puisse lire. Notre malade va assez bien, mais pourtant, on le saignera ce soir. Adieu." The teenage Marie-Antoinette still has irregular handwriting. Now, the subject matter may not seem fascinating, but there's lots to learn. This letter shows that the circuit for sending mail is important. Marie-Antoinette has not entrusted her letter to the French court's network. To get it to her mother in Austria, she sends it to the ambassador. This means it's far from prying eyes. Now, there was a lot of spying at court, a bit like the bugging of embassies in the days of the Cold War. Diplomats and courtiers tried to get hold of information surreptitiously, for instance, by having access to mail when it was in transit. And Marie-Antoinette indicates here that the letter she's sending on contains no confidential material, so no particular precautions need to be taken. Marie-Antoinette's letters vary greatly in length, from one line to several pages. She often wastes paper, though it was expensive at the time. Some notes are tiny, and the pencil on the left of the screen gives you an idea of the scale. And the material aspect is worth considering here. Often Marie-Antoinette just needs to make an appointment or to ask a quick question, as we might in an email or a text message. And you can see in the center examples of a small envelope. There's no address. Clearly, a trusted intermediary was given the task of handing the note over. And the wax seal shows that a true confidentiality is used at times and that messages mustn't fall into the hands of those for whom they were not intended. The small size made notes easy to hide, which was important if they contained confidential information. Because the notes were generally delivered by hand, they didn't need to be signed, and they often don't have a date or only have a very partial indication, like à 11h03 or ce vendredi à 11h du matin, and that makes working out the chronology very difficult. When the royal family was forced to leave Versailles for Paris during the Revolution, communications became harder. The Queen didn't just have to contend with the prying eyes of courtiers, diplomats, and staff. Surrounded in the Tuileries by hostile figures like Revolutionary Guards, she had to be even more wary of what she was doing. To complicate matters further, her brother, the Emperor, sent Ambassador Merci away in late 1790 as part of his attempts to pacify the Austrian Netherlands. Marie-Antoinette continued corresponding with him. This meant running far greater risks than when it had just been about sending a note from Paris to Versailles. And one of the decisions was to use ciphers for anything sensitive. The ciphers were polyalphabetic, so a single letter could replace several other letters. And they were based on a key word which only served once. Both parties to the correspondence had the same edition of a book. They indicated a number at the top of the ciphered letter. This referred to a page, and the first word of that page was the key to the cipher for that particular letter. Now, over the years, from the young Archduchess's first steps at court in Versailles to the Queen's far-reaching consideration of foreign policy when she found herself under house arrest with a depressive and inert husband, the subjects of Marie-Antoinette's correspondence range widely. So here to give an example is a letter written when the Queen's brother Ferdinand, Grand Duke of Tuscany, was visiting Versailles. He had to be entertained. It fell upon Marie-Antoinette to organize things. and several notes between her and the ambassador show her bending over backwards to accommodate visitors from Austria or Lorraine. Now, this is easy to date because visits by archdukes leave traces in diplomatic correspondences and the press. Others are harder to sort out. Take this elliptical note. In appearance, we've very little to go on, no name or date. But here the Queen refers to her appartement d'en haut, her upstairs apartment. We know that in the Tuileries, she had two apartments, one on top of the other. So this note was written during the Revolution, after the royal family's arrival in Paris in October 1789, and before Mercy's departure for France in late 1790. So it's not hugely precise, but at least it narrows things down. Another question you often have to answer if you have a name is, who is who? Here we have a title, but no name or place. Il vaut mieux que vous m'ameniez le général aujourd'hui. Marie-Antoinette's letters to her mother show that there's one visitor to Versailles to whom they both refer simply as le général, Field Marshal Pellegrini. Marie-Antoinette welcomed him in October 1776, and we know more about the circumstances thanks to a letter from Mercy to the Empress. La reine se mettait à sa toilette entre 10 et 11 heures. J'épiais ce moment pour lui faire ma cour. Et quand Sa Majesté avait quelque chose de particulier à me dire, elle faisait retirer pour quelques instants ses friseurs et ses femmes. Ce fut dans une de ces occasions que je présentai le comte de Pellegrini, que la reine traita avec bonté. It was hard for the Queen to be alone, and the painting by Gauthier d'Agoty on your screen gives an indication of everything going at once. Music teacher, dressmaker, pleading aristocrat, etc. are all around the Queen. For those of you who are opera buffs, the scene at the Marshalin's dressing table in Der Rosenkavalier often makes me think of this. Another element the correspondence shows is that even before the revolution, Marie-Antoinette was coming under pressure from Austria to intervene in French policy. The ambassador regularly reminded her that she was Austrian and had duties to her homeland. This note tells us that Mercy has instructed her in how to behave. She's to give the king a letter from the emperor, which has reached her via Mercy, and then just to show him two other missives and not let him keep them, copy them, or show them to anyone else. Je ne comprends rien du tout à la nouvelle dont mon frère parle. Je désire que cela soit vrai. Je vais remettre au roi sa lettre et lui montrer en même temps la vôtre et la mienne. Je n'y vois aucun inconvénient, surtout les retirant tout de suite. Je suis enchantée que vous ayez été content de notre comédie. J'ai voulu vous chercher dans la loge après le spectacle, mais vous étiez parti. Ma fille a la fièvre tierce bien décidément. Son accès de hier a été moins fort. J'espère que cela va se civiliser. Adieu, voici le roi. The last paragraph packs a mass of historical information in a short space. Marie-Antoinette loved the theatre. She had a minute stage built for her in Trianon. Only the royal household and members of her immediate family were invited to see her on stage. She made an exception for Ambassador Mercy in October 1780. He saw her as Colette in Rousseau's Le Devin du Village. He found her voice pleasant and well-pitched, her acting manner graceful and noble, but he did warn her against amateur dramatics, which he saw as a possible source of intrigue. The second element in the letter's last paragraph concerns the royal couple's daughter, conceived after 7 years of an unconsummated marriage. Little Madame Royale was living. Now, the doctor wasn't worried, but the Queen was, and she writes movingly to her mother of the child suffering, and she was ready to cancel everything to look after the baby. And here is Madame Royale at the time. And if you see, she's got very red cheeks on the picture. So I do wonder if the painting is a reflection of the fact that she was teething. The third important element in the final paragraph is the abrupt ending. Adieu, voici le roi. Farewell, here comes the king. It shows the Queen being interrupted. It also suggests she might have wanted to hide what she was writing from her husband. Marie-Antoinette was involved in French political lobbying from before the revolution. Her desire to further Austria's suit is clear when she passes on information which is not yet public, like the news of the death of a French ambassador. This note starts, j'apprends dans l'instant par Monsieur de Vergennes que Monsieur Dusson est en apoplexie, and ends, gardez-moi le secret, car le roi lui-même ne sait pas encore la maladie de Monsieur Dusson. So the king doesn't know. He might have been out hunting, for instance, but the trust Marie-Antoinette has in Mercy is evident in this desire to inform him immediately. Whilst the emperor was grateful for the information passed on and the ambassador fulsome in his thanks, this was not always the case. A letter from Mercy in 1787 to Chancellor Kaunitz refers to a conversation in which the Queen refused to give in to diplomatic bullying. The Austrians had a candidate in mind for the post of French foreign minister. Marie-Antoinette suggested his name to the king, but it wasn't his choice. Mercy was incensed, as he reports to the Chancellor. Il prit tout à coup à la reine le scrupule qu'il n'était pas juste que la cour de Vienne nommât les ministres de celle de Versailles. J'eus à essuyer à l'appui de cette thèse les réflexions les plus étranges. Kaunitz answered, comparing the queen to a bad debtor in her behavior. Si elle était reine ailleurs qu'en France, on ne lui permettrait aucune ingérence dans les affaires, ni pour le dehors, ni pour le dedans, et elle serait nulle par conséquent dans toute l'étendue du terme. Ne comptons jamais sur rien de sa part et contentons-nous d'en tirer, comme d'un mauvais payeur, tout ce que nous pourrons. The statesman had little consideration for Marie-Antoinette. Her reaction demonstrates that she would not have done anything to favor Austria if she believed it to be contrary to France's interests. Her desire was for her two nations, that of her birth and that of her marriage, to be allies forever. And after the storming of the Bastille and the royal family's removal from Versailles, France, as she knew it, underwent a sea change. The Queen's letters to Merci in the Austrian Netherlands are completely different to the quick notes sent when he was arranging to bring visitors to Versailles. These are weighty missives dealing with pressing concerns like where to find money if the royal family is to mount an attempt to wrest power back from the National Assembly, how foreign troops massing on the border might back the royalists, how to handle the émigrés, and so on. Throughout her correspondence, Marie-Antoinette reiterates her trust in Merci. He spent the revolution playing down her plight and suggesting both to her and to the Austrian emperor a wait-and-see attitude, which seems callous, particularly when we have his energetic protestations against the confiscation of the contents of his wine cellar in France. Both Marie-Antoinette and Merci had the same tutelary figure whom they worshipped, Empress Maria Theresa. The image of her certainly harmed Marie-Antoinette's public figure in France, as she was seen as a terrifying incarnation of foreign female power, and France even now is reticent when faced with women in the public sphere, particularly foreign ones. But the same image of her mother sustained her during her imprisonment. The last letter from Marie-Antoinette to Merci on July 4th, 1792, shows she was in fear for her life. The reference to Maria Theresa which ends it smacks of desperation. Malgré tous ces dangers, nous ne changerons pas de résolution. Vous devez y compter autant que je compte sur votre attachement. Je me plais à croire que je partage le sentiment qui vous attachait à ma mère. Voilà le moment de m'en donner une grande preuve en sauvant moi et les miens, moi, s'il en est temps. Marie-Antoinette had constantly and consistently refused offers to be saved if it meant leaving her husband and children. France was her nation, whatever her pride in her Austrian lineage. Conditions for the royal family became impossible, and after the storming of the Tuileries a month later, they were incarcerated in a fortress in central Paris. The king was executed in January 1793. The Dauphin was removed from his mother. She was subsequently taken to the Conciergerie. At her trial, she was accused of various appalling actions. Trumped up charges of incest were laid against her. She answered calmly and with dignity. The revolutionaries could not prove one of the other charges, that she had corresponded with the enemy. At a time when all foreigners were considered enemies, she'd clearly been exchanging information with foreign powers, but in a bid to restore the monarchy as she had known it. Marie-Antoinette was executed on October 16th, 1793. Now, as she's revealed by this correspondence, Marie-Antoinette is a better rounded character than historians generally show. She develops over time, she enjoys parties and the theatre when young, she's a loving mother, she's above all a woman of duty who believed she had a mission in life and would have to answer to God after death. In her relationship with Merci, it is paradoxically he who has the upper hand, using and abusing the fact that he was older and could be seen as a parental figure, blackmailing her emotionally by indicating that she must not disappoint the empress or the emperor. Weak at times, but strong at others, left without guidance, but doing her best, neither the macaroon-eating airhead that Hollywood so loves, or the monstrous and lubricious harpy of caricatures, Marie-Antoinette, when you listen to her own words, comes across as a better rounded and profoundly human character.
Catriona, thank you very much indeed. That was incredibly wide-ranging and fascinating, particularly on a character whose name I think everyone knows, but actually is often not very well understood. I know that you can be with us for another sort of 10 minutes or so and answer some of the questions which are pouring in through our various social media platforms. So let me get right to that, if I may. And I'm going to ask one of my own, but combine it with one that's come in from Kelly on email, because I think actually this gets to the heart of where you left off in a sense. Kelly's asking, why do you think so many myths built up around Marie-Antoinette herself rather than her husband? Is it because of the way that women have been represented in history more general, or is it specific to her? What do you think about that?
I think it's a great question, and it does get to the nub of things. Marie-Antoinette, when she was Queen of France, was only queen because she was the king's wife, and therefore she was a consort, she was a secondary figure. But when she was executed, she was turned into a political figure. And I think that gave her a different status, and it allowed her to be shown as a sort of martyr, because you can understand the political agenda behind putting a ruler to death. So putting the king to death, for instance, because you're changing the figurehead. But it seemed gratuitous to kill the queen. And I think that gave her the renewed status and made her, turned her into this sort of martyr figure. I think also because there is this presumption of not innocence, but at least of non-direct political role, it makes the punishment seem worse, and therefore it may have made people more sympathetic to Marie-Antoinette. And I think also Marie-Antoinette was such a recognizable figure. She'd been painted so often, there were engravings of her and so on, that it was a sort of newsworthy item to have a beautiful woman killed.
So there was a sort of almost kind of shock value in the whole thing in that sense.
There was very much, you're quite right, Rana, a shock value. And you see that when you read people's letters. People writing at the time from overseas, from London, for instance, or from Geneva, will say, you know, the king's death, in a sense, was expected, and the king had a proper trial. The queen had a completely jumped up trial, which was very quick. She wasn't allowed a proper defense and this sort of thing. And therefore it seems to a lot of observers from outside that the regime is getting more and more cruel in a less justifiable manner.
Well, let me use that, if I may, Catriona, to turn to a question that comes from Christopher, and that's coming through Facebook. And in a sense, Christopher's question, I'll give you just a second, but it speaks to something wider that we think we know about Marie-Antoinette, which is, was it not her response to disgruntled citizens that triggered the French Revolution? This is a version of the let them eat cake story, of course, which is the one thing that everyone thinks they know. Is there any sense in which she's a political actor in domestic politics as opposed to the court diplomatic interactions that you described? Is there any justification to that at all?
There is some justification because the court actions, of course, have impact on government, and Marie-Antoinette is very clearly getting interested in who is appointed to a portfolio as a minister, for instance, at certain stages. So she does have some political agency, very, very clearly. But I mean, this political lobbying has its limits in that, you know, she's doing what she can, but she doesn't have any authority. So the king is the one who has to accept, and the king is the one who has to appoint a minister, etc. And obviously the revolution takes over, but at no stage has she had direct power, but that hasn't stopped her going about lobbying and trying to achieve certain results.
And clearly the interactions with Merci and others and what goes on at the court shows that she is perceived as certainly someone who has enough agency to be able to change certain diplomatic protocols and priorities.
That's quite right. And I mentioned briefly the question of her being Austrian. Marie-Antoinette is Austrian, and I alluded to the reversal of the traditional alignment of the European powers. France and Austria were not traditionally friends, and they had become friends just after Marie-Antoinette's birth, when they signed something which was known as the renversement des alliances, the reversal of the alliances. And as a result, when Marie-Antoinette as a teenager arrived at court in Versailles, for many people, she was a representative of a hereditary enemy power. And in that respect, there was a huge, I think, groundswell of opinion in certain quarters against her as a representative of Austria before you even go into what she was like as an individual or how she acted.
And I think that point you just made, which is about the way in which leaders and rulers and queens and kings are perceived gets to another little crop of questions we've had. I'm going to sort of group them together because they relate very much to the perception of Marie-Antoinette, not just in her own time, but actually in our own as well. So let me start, if I may, with just going the ones here. Yeah, this is from Chris, comes in through Facebook. Is Marie-Antoinette viewed differently in France today compared to what she is in England?
Well, I'll tell you something anecdotally, which is when I first started working on Marie-Antoinette, you know, you go to a dinner party as an academic and people say, oh, you're an academic, and, you know, what are you working on? And I'd been working on various things, and, you know, people's eyes sometimes glaze over because they don't understand what we're doing. But when I said I'm working on Marie-Antoinette, instantly there would be engagement and a reaction. But it would depend on who I was having dinner with that day. If I was talking to, you know, sort of fairly left-wing colleagues, they'd say, oh, you know, the Austrian whore. Or if I was talking to sort of right-wing colleagues, they'd say, oh, poor thing, she was such a martyr. She was treated so badly. So these two very extreme reactions about the same person. And on a number of occasions, people have said to me, but if you work on Marie-Antoinette, this is people in France, if you work on Marie-Antoinette, does it mean that you're a royalist? And I say, well, no, Marie-Antoinette is an object of study for me. And I'm working on Marie-Antoinette. I could also just as well be working on her revolutionary adversaries. There is no identification between the author and the subject. So that's a slightly circuitous way of answering the question. I think in France, the revolution hasn't quite ended yet. And the revolutionary reference is still clear. One of your correspondents was referring to the let them eat cake phrase, which we all think we know about Marie-Antoinette and which she never said. There was graffiti on the walls of Paris at the end of last year when there was a lot of civil unrest, which turned either President Macron or indeed even his wife, Brigitte Macron, into Marie-Antoinette figures by repurposing the sentence, the qu'il mange de la brioche, saying, you know, if they don't have any gas, you know, they could use petrol type of thing, or, you know, if they don't have any bread, let them eat cake. So it's very much a reference which is there as an active political reference. And I give you another example, which is caricatures. One of France's best known caricaturists or political cartoonists is the very talented Plantu, whose drawings often grace the front page of Le Monde. And Marie-Antoinette is an obvious person for him to use when he's trying to depict a politician, preferably, but not always, a right-wing politician, who is out of touch with reality. So Marie-Antoinette will come to the fore and you'll have someone dressed up as Marie-Antoinette. There are references to Marie-Antoinette in the revolutionary period, also in government. So in the same way as we have Hansard, which tells us what's going on in the parliamentary debates, the French you know, have notes of what's said in their different houses of parliament, and Marie-Antoinette comes up, or revolutionary references come up. And I think in that respect, there is still very much this sort of vision of Marie-Antoinette as a political symbol. There's also very clearly pride in the aesthetic aspects of Marie-Antoinette. The Trianon in Versailles was restored recently, along with the Hameau de la Reine, so the sort of mock village which was built for Marie-Antoinette. And if you've not been, I would encourage you, as soon as you are able to travel to Paris, to go and walk around. It's very charming. So there is pride in the style and in the elegance, I think, which she represents, but also some form of disquiet about the way in which she's symbolic of a ruling class which had lost touch with the wider public.
I found myself, when you were saying, giving that very interesting and wide-ranging answer, Catriona, coming back to Lady Carberry's question in the Trollope novel, The Way We Live Now, in which she says in that first thing, the first explanation, that she wouldn't quite acquit Marie-Antoinette. Would you acquit her? Or the question, I suppose, is really, you know, what do you think of her? You spent a long time living with her. How do you find her?
Well, I mean, my answer to the would I acquit her would be of what is she being accused? I mean, I think there are some things of which, you know, she's accused and we can acquit her, and others where we cannot. She's an interesting character because she evolves over time. Indubitably, as a young woman, she's a bit of an airhead, very naive, but, you know, were any of us any better when we were 14, 15, 16? And would we have been any better had we been wrenched from our home and dumped in a completely different environment? I don't think I would have been, but there we are. So there were times when she was clearly out of touch with reality. Could she have done things differently? I don't know. I don't know. The letters, I think, show the way in which there is a process of sort of, you know, she becomes more aware of what's going on. There's a process of growing up, but also growing, maturing, I think, intellectually. She's not equipped with the necessary education, for instance. Her political knowledge is essentially acquired pragmatically and through experience. She hasn't received, you know, very high-level tutoring in politics. Gendered education is clearly a factor here. So I think she's, Stefan Zweig wrote a very interesting biography of Marie-Antoinette when he was the first to use bits of the correspondence, not these letters, but some other letters, particularly the ones Marie-Antoinette exchanged with her mother. And Stefan Zweig says, in a sense, she was a sort of an ordinary individual who had an extraordinary destiny. And I think that's probably quite true. I don't think that she was, you know, an exceptional character, you know, exceptionally bad or exceptionally good. I think, you know, she was like most of us, but that she did have an absolutely extraordinary destiny, and one I would wish on nobody.
No, quite. Well, maybe we'll finish up there. I mean, I'm going to skip past the question from Rostislav, but I will read it out to you. It came in on YouTube, largely because I think that Rostislav, whoever you are, you operate in a slightly different income bracket from most Oxford tutors. And his question is, why do you think the most expensive Breguet watch is named after Marie-Antoinette? But we'll leave that to the realm of the imagination. Let me ask...
we can answer that.
Go on then. Well, you've got one. You're going to show us yours, are you, Catriona?
I would like to. No, the Breguet watch was stolen. A watch was made, thought to be for Marie-Antoinette by Breguet, who was the greatest watchmaker. So it's a historical illusion. But Breguet is using Marie-Antoinette in a sense for her power of advertising. But Breguet also paid quite a lot towards the restoration of the Petit Trianon. So that is very much a marketing issue, but a marketing issue which, like the best ones, is actually rooted in some form of historical knowledge.
Sure. Well, in that case, Rostislav, you've got your very, very expert answer there, and I hope you're enjoying your sparkling wristwatch while you get that. Let me finish, if I may, by essentially thinking about this question of how much of what we understand about Marie-Antoinette is teleological. You know, she meets this bloody and horrific end. She becomes a huge historical figure as a result. Without that endpoint, if she'd just been another queen, would she still be of significant historical interest? Obviously not the same level of having world renown, but would she still be someone worth looking at if everything had been the same up to about 1788, 89?
I think she'd have been interesting for the historian. I do not think she would have had anything like the renown she has now. And we've got an obvious comparison, and that is Empress Eugénie, the wife of Napoleon III. Empress Eugénie ended up in exile in England, and everybody's completely forgotten about her. Marie-Antoinette, because she was executed, I think, has become a figure in whom everyone is interested and has this worldwide renown. And I might perhaps end by referring to Germaine de Staël, the extraordinary daughter of a Swiss banker who became a minister in France under the Ancien Régime, Necker, or Necre, as he was known at the time. Germaine de Staël, in August 1793, so 2 months before the Queen was executed, when it wasn't sure that she was even going to be put on trial, wrote an open pamphlet in which she suggested that the Queen should not be put to death for various reasons. And the reasons are extremely interesting, including the question of where the revolution will be going in its attitude towards women, towards sentiment, and so on, if the Queen were executed. But it also includes the reflection, en l'immolant, vous la consacrez à jamais. So if you execute her, if you sacrifice her, that's what immoler is, if you sacrifice her, you will immortalize her, you will make her sacred. And I think that is exactly what happened. Paradoxically, the revolutionaries who were trying to put an end to a regime they hated by executing Marie-Antoinette actually turned her into this incredibly visible figure.
Having your head cut off, great career move. Just ask King Charles. Works for some anyway. Catriona, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk, which has generated a whole storm of questions. I wish we had time to answer them all, but I know that time is limited. But I think we've learned a great deal about someone whose name we all knew, but the facts, I think, have been very, very well illuminated by the talk. I'm just reminding our viewers that there will, of course, be another Oxford at Home next week. Slightly different time. We've been normally doing this about 3:15, but in fact, next week it'll be the earlier time of 12:45 p.m., Friday, 24th of July. The topic is, when is it okay to graffiti a temple? In case you're wondering, this is not a reference to recent statue destroying activities, but actually is about ancient Egyptology with Dr. Elizabeth Froude. So I think that's going to be fascinating and well worth coming in for. You can find out more details on the webpage just below the video. Thank you to Professor Catriona Seth, Marshal Foch Professor of French Literature in the University of Oxford. Thank you to everyone watching from around the world, and look forward to seeing you next week on Oxford at Home. Thank you.
Bye all.